We accept the relentless acceleration of urban construction and mechanical automation as the default state of human evolution. Modern societies define human success through continuous material change and technological expansion, establishing these as the objective baseline for progress. But in his foundational text, Orient et Occident, French philosopher René Guénon presents a severe counterthesis. He argues that the modern West is not the apex of human development. Instead, it is a radical historical anomaly. When British author Rudyard Kipling wrote, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet," he articulated the defining perspective of the colonial era. Guénon points out that this phrase is essentially a conqueror's admission. It reveals a frustration that the people the West has conquered physically carry within them an order of intelligence that material power simply cannot grasp. To understand this disconnect, we have to trace the vocabulary we use to measure success. The word civilization, in the absolute universal sense we use today, did not exist until the second half of the 18th century. It was an ideological construct invented by Western economists like Turgot to describe their own localized industrial prosperity. If you presented that word to a scholar in classical antiquity or the European Middle Ages, they would not know what to do with it. Those societies operated entirely without a concept of linear, indefinite material progression. They had no single term for what we now call civilization because they did not equate societal worth with mechanical development. The modern West has taken a highly specific, recent ideology of material accumulation and projected it onto the entire globe. By defining its own economic history as the absolute standard of human existence, the West enforces its particular anomaly as a universal truth. This diagram illustrates the traditional architecture of human knowledge maintained by civilizations across history. It is a rigid, vertical hierarchy. At the summit is metaphysics, or pure intellectuality. Below it sits reason, and at the wide base is the material world. In this structure, metaphysics represents pure, supra-rational principles, the universal truths from which all other forms of knowledge derive. The top tier radiates downward, providing the anchoring principles that give reason and material science their ultimate validity and direction. Starting prominently with Descartes, the modern West actively severed this hierarchy. By restricting intelligence to mere rationalism and denying any knowledge beyond the physical, the top tier was shattered. Pure intellectuality was abandoned, leaving human reason and the material world completely isolated. With the path to vertical intellectual depth closed, human activity was redirected entirely into the only remaining dimension, the material plane. This shift forced an aggressive outward expansion, as the drive for growth, now severed from any higher principle, could only find expression through the infinite accumulation of physical data and mechanical power. This flattened architecture birthed the defining obsession of the modern era. When a society eliminates the intellect's upward capacity, its aspirations become strictly confined to the physical and the emotional. Development becomes synonymous with generating industrial machinery and satisfying sentimental desires. The West routinely confuses this horizontal accumulation of data and mechanics with true vertical growth. It has built a system capable of infinite outward expansion, yet it entirely lacks any foundational anchoring principle. Once the post-Cartesian boundary was drawn, Western intelligence was strictly confined. Reason was reduced to its lowest possible function, measuring, observing, and manipulating the phenomena of the sensible world to serve practical utility. Even modern attempts to react against strict rationalism fail to escape the material box. The philosopher Henri Bergson, seen here, promoted a philosophy of intuitionism, but he still accepted the premise that intelligence is merely a tool for fabricating artificial objects. Guenon identifies this as the superstition of life, a worldview that replaces the obsession with inorganic matter with an obsession with living matter while remaining completely blind to anything beyond the physical. This diagram captures modern empirical science. It operates exclusively by analysis, fracturing knowledge through continuous division. The assumption is that stacking these isolated fragments will build a unified synthesis of reality, but this structure is inherently unstable and regularly collapses. A durable synthesis cannot be constructed from the bottom up. Analysis, by its very nature, can proceed to infinity within a given domain. You can divide matter forever without ever accidentally arriving at a higher metaphysical principle. The West masks this theoretical dead end by pointing to its practical successes. Because analysis produces mechanical inventions and vast industrial wealth, the public substitutes industry for science, assuming that physical utility is proof of absolute truth. Equating technological utility with theoretical truth creates the illusion of scientism. This worldview achieves total mastery over the manipulation of matter, yet leaves the observer entirely ignorant of the nature of reality itself. To see exactly what the West has abandoned, we must look at the alternative epistemological model maintained by Eastern traditional civilizations. Traditional knowledge begins at a fixed summit, labeled universal principles, radiating downward. At the base are contingent sciences, astronomy, logic, arithmetic. They are strictly anchored to the top, functioning solely as downward applications of higher metaphysical principles. Within this traditional system, a material fact is never studied as an independent, isolated subject. The physical world is only considered worth studying to the extent that it serves as an outward manifestation of a higher, immutable order. Because it is anchored to unchanging principles, this top-down system possesses an inherent stability. This stands in sharp contrast to the chaotic agitation, constant ideological turnover, and endless need for novelty that characterizes the Western horizontal system. From the perspective of traditional civilizations, Western empirical science is not an advanced state of learning. Stripped of any connection to universal principles, it is viewed merely as profane wisdom, a highly detailed appearance of knowledge that entirely lacks an essence. We can observe exactly how this structural disconnect operates through a specific historical case study, the 17th century philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his attempt to decipher the ancient Chinese text, the I Ching. Leibniz was developing a universal characteristic, attempting to decode the qua, the traditional Chinese symbols, using his newly invented system of binary arithmetic. Looking at the I Ching hexagrams in their circular format, Leibniz applied a strict analytical methodology. He aggressively mapped his 0 and 1 binary system onto the broken and solid lines, stripping away the complex geometric layers until reducing the symbols to a flat mathematical formula. Submitting his findings to the Paris Academy of Sciences, Leibniz triumphantly concluded he had found the lost meaning of the Chinese symbols. He assumed the Chinese scholars had forgotten their own knowledge, and that their sacred texts were merely a primitive attempt at Western math. But the true nature of the Guia escapes this entirely. They are pure metaphysical symbols, representing universal principles. Because they sit at the top of the intellectual hierarchy, they are capable of infinite downward applications, whether in logic, sociology, or astronomy. Leibniz's arithmetic application was not mathematically incorrect, but in the traditional framework, an arithmetic application represents a low-level material contingency. To the Chinese, reducing metaphysical principles to mere counting numbers was a trivial exercise. This intellectual arrogance continues with modern Orientalists. Guénon critiques Western scholars who attempt to force Eastern doctrines through the narrow lens of Western philosophy, such as interpreting ancient Hindu metaphysics through the pessimism of Arthur Schopenhauer, seen here. Leibniz's error isolates the Western anomaly. It demonstrates the catastrophic failure of comprehension that occurs when a horizontal epistemology attempts to absorb a vertical one, mistaking the highest synthesis for the lowest analysis. This horizontal architecture produces a distinct psychological consequence within Western society. It creates a malady of endless research, where intellectual agitation is pursued simply for the sake of movement. Lacking a higher metaphysical principle to anchor absolute truth, the modern West substitutes the search for knowledge in place of the actual acquisition of knowledge. The goal is no longer finding a definitive answer, but fueling an endless cycle of artificial problems and hypotheses. This diagram illustrates another symptom of the anomaly, the compulsion for vulgarization. Driven by a democratic demand for obligatory instruction, complex multidimensional knowledge is forced through a flat filter of popularization. It emerges on the other side shattered into simplistic, disconnected, two-dimensional shapes. To make an idea accessible to everyone indiscriminately, it must necessarily be deformed. Truths are stripped of their depth, replaced by rote memorization, and reduced to easily digestible facts to satisfy a mass audience. When education prioritizes the accumulation of simplified facts over the actual assimilation of principles, it replaces intelligence with mere memory. By presenting complex subjects as simple for the sake of the masses, it grants the student a false sense of mastery over the topic. This environment produces what Guenon calls the primary mentality, a state where individuals, convinced by their own half-instruction, speak on any subject with authority, mistaking their own lack of depth for the simplicity of the truth. The West views its aggressive outward expansion, its mechanical ingenuity, and its material disruption as the supreme definition of progress. Yet, traditional civilizations interpret these exact same phenomena in reverse. They see this relentless need for change as a mark of manifest inferiority. Without a principle of higher order to guide it, Western expansion appears merely as a highly industrialized barbarism. This disconnect becomes actively destructive through the Western fury of proselytism. The West frequently disguises its material conquest as a moralistic civilizing mission, enforcing its specific horizontal anomaly upon the rest of the globe. This comparison shows the ultimate structural incompatibility. On the left, the stable, vertical, traditional hierarchy. On the right, the endlessly expanding, unstable horizontal plane of the modern West. The analytical spread of the West is mechanically incapable of comprehending the synthetic depth of the East. Any genuine dialogue between the two remains impossible as long as the West assumes its mastery over matter is the universal standard for human intelligence. True understanding requires the West to recognize its own status. It must acknowledge that in its pursuit of technological dominance, it traded pure human intellect for the restless, sterile agitation of the material world.